It started with a single thump, a heavy knife striking wet wood, the kind of sound that settled over the early morning like a warning bell no one wanted to hear. In the heart of a medieval town, before the sun rose over the crooked rooftops and fog still clung to the cobbled streets like a thick blanket, a man named Elric was already awake. While others slept, nestled in hay-stuffed beds or curled beside cooling hearths, Elric was pulling on his blood-stained apron with hands already aching from the day before. He was a butcher, and being a butcher in the Middle Ages wasn't just a job. It was a burden, one he carried in silence. Elric's shop stood near the town's edge, downwind, of course. It had to be. No one wanted to smell what he dealt with every day: flesh, fat bone, rot, and worse. People needed meat, but they didn't want to see where it came from. That was Elric's role, to do the dirty work others couldn't stomach. His door didn't have a sign, just a rusted nail where a pig's foot once hung. That was enough. In the dark hours, when dew still coated the wooden shutters and rats scurried between empty carts, Elric would lift his cleaver and begin. Slaughter came before breakfast. There were no gloves, no aprons that kept the blood from soaking in, no water that stayed clean long enough, just a stone table, a dull blade, and the sound of life leaving something that had trusted you not to hurt it. Some might imagine butchers as burly men with thick arms and rough beards, but Elric was quiet, careful, almost gentle. He didn't talk much. People said he had once been a farmer, before his sickness took his land and a lord claimed the rest. Now he lived alone above his shop, surrounded by knives, salted skins, and silence. But life for a butcher wasn't just about blood. It was about rules. So many rules. The town guilds watched him closely. If he sold meat that was too old, he could be fined. If his stall dripped too much blood into the streets, he could be beaten. If he forgot to pay the church tax on awful sales, yes, even the bits no one wanted, he risked a visit from the magistrate. Even his waste had to be dumped in a specific pit beyond the town wall, or else. Nothing came easy, and yet the townsfolk came. Every morning, women with baskets and men in patched cloaks stepped carefully into Elric's stall. They didn't meet his eyes. They pointed. 2 ribs. No fat on that cut. Got liver today? Elric nodded, chopped, wrapped, and said little. Only the children looked at him with curiosity. The others moved on quickly, eager to forget the smell, eager to pretend the meat they carried had never been part of something living. Behind the shop, beyond a sagging door and down 3 crooked steps, was the kill room, damp and dark, lit only by a narrow shaft of light that slipped through a hole in the ceiling. That light, soft and golden in the early hours, was the only thing beautiful about the space. Everything else was cold and wet and old. Iron hooks, barrels of brine, stained walls that whispered stories no one wanted to hear twice. Elric didn't talk about what he saw in there. The things animals did when they were scared, the way their eyes begged, the way silence fell afterward, thick and heavy like tar. He carried all of it quietly. It wasn't something you shared. Not even at the tavern, where even drunk men knew better than to ask a butcher how his day had gone. Sometimes, the job came with things no one expected, like the time a cow came in already half sick, or when the river froze over and there was no water to clean the blood, or when a rich man insisted on veal, and Elric had to do something he still couldn't forget. Being a medieval butcher wasn't just hard. It changed you. It chipped away at something inside. At night, when the shutters closed and the hearth crackled with fading warmth, Elric would sit alone, his hands cracked and calloused, resting on his knees. He didn't pray much anymore, not after all he'd seen, but he would listen to the town, to the wind, to the occasional scream of a stray dog near the waste pit, and he'd wonder, was he cursed or just needed? The plague had passed through not long ago. It spared Elric, though he buried more than he cared to count. No one wanted to butcher meat during the plague. Even rats seemed smarter than that. But when it was over and the church bell tolled for the last time, they came back to him, thin, pale, desperate. He didn't raise his prices. He didn't say a word. He just got to work, because that's what butchers did. They served the living and buried the rest. The guild had no sympathy. They still demanded dues, still inspected his knives, still made him pay for the blood that soaked into the dirt outside his stall. And once, when a pig turned out to be diseased, they came with soldiers. They fined him, beat him, threatened to cut off his hands. He tried to explain he hadn't known, but it didn't matter. Butchers had no voice. And yet he stayed. He kept going, day after day, year after year, through frost, heat, hunger, and war. He was part of the town's heartbeat, even if no one liked to admit it. The taverns served his pork. The castle ate his beef. The beggars chewed his scraps. But no one invited him to weddings. No one asked for his name. He was the butcher. That was all. Until one day, a stranger came to town. Not a noble, not a peasant. Something else. A man in a dark cloak, with gloves too clean and a voice too smooth. He didn't speak to anyone at first. Just walked the market, watching, listening. And then, just as the sun began to set and the streets turned golden gray, he stepped into Elric's stall. He didn't ask for ribs, didn't ask for liver. He just stood there, studying Elric like he already knew him. Then, softly, he said something strange. "You've been hiding something, haven't you?" Elric didn't reply. Not at first, because in that moment, the knife in his hand felt heavier than ever. And the past, the part no one knew about, started to claw its way back to the surface. Elric didn't move. The stranger's words hung in the air like steam from a boiling pot, soft but impossible to ignore. The knife in his hand, freshly wiped but never truly clean, remained still against the chopping block. The stranger stepped forward slowly, the soft leather of his boots whispering against the straw-covered floor. "You don't recognize me," he said, almost kindly, "but I've heard stories about a butcher, a quiet man, a man who does what others won't." Still, Elric said nothing. The market sounds outside had faded. The chatter, the cart wheels, the clucking of hens, and all that remained was the drip-drip of water from a pipe overhead. Or maybe it wasn't water. In that room, one could never be entirely sure. The stranger leaned closer, but not enough to cross the invisible line between customer and worker. "You ever wonder," he said, lowering his voice, "why you've been left alone all these years? After everything?" Elric finally lifted his gaze. His eyes weren't angry, just tired. He'd heard enough riddles from drunk men and traveling monks to know when a sentence wasn't meant to be finished. "Do you want meat or not?" he asked, voice rough from disuse. The stranger smiled faintly. "Not yet. First, I need to know something." Elric exhaled slowly and turned away, placing the knife down with care. "I don't do favors," he muttered. "I'm not asking for one." There was a pause. Then the stranger spoke again. "I think you remember the winter of the fire, when half the town starved and 3 guildmen vanished without explanation. That was, 15 years ago?" Elric didn't reply, but his hands paused mid-movement. He had been sorting cuts, arranging them with mechanical precision, but now his fingers just hovered, frozen. The man continued. "Records were lost, testimonies burnt, but I've read what's left. I came to find out what really happened." Elric stared at the stained floorboards. That winter. Yes, he remembered, more clearly than he liked. The snow came early that year and didn't leave until spring. Crops failed. Livestock froze in their pens. The wealthy hoarded. The poor rioted. And in the chaos, men disappeared. 3 of them had names. 3 had power. 3 had last been seen walking past Elric's shop, one snowy evening, arguing about the price of salted beef. He remembered the sound of their voices. He remembered the look in their eyes when they realized something wasn't right. He remembered the way snow covered everything so quickly afterward. And he remembered the silence. Elric reached for a cloth and wiped his hand slowly. The stranger watched, patient, calm. "There's no story here," Elric said finally. "Just hunger, cold, and men who thought they'd never run out of power." The man tilted his head. "That may be true, but the pit behind your shop was filled in shortly after. And no one asked why." Elric didn't flinch. "Animals die every day." "Yes," the man said softly, "but not all of them wear rings with town seals." Elric turned toward him now, expression unreadable. "And what would you do with that story, if it were true?" The stranger didn't blink. "I'd write it, archive it, let the record finally speak for itself. No one wants that story told." "I do," The wind picked up outside, pushing cold air through the cracks in the wood. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and went silent. Elric leaned forward, resting both hands on the counter. "You think I buried secrets for fun?" he said, voice low and even. "You think I like being the one who had to choose who ate and who didn't?" The stranger didn't answer. "They came to me with silver," Elric went on. "Not to buy meat, to buy silence, to buy whatever was left in the storeroom while families outside begged for bones. I didn't kill them, but I didn't stop what happened next either." There was a long silence. The stranger looked down, then nodded slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I just needed to hear it from someone who was there." Then he turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, Elric spoke again. "You came all this way. Ask the right question." The man turned back slowly, confused. Elric's eyes were steady. "Ask me what I buried in the second pit. The one no one knows about." A beat passed. The stranger said nothing, because in truth, he hadn't known about a second pit. Not until now. And as the butcher's words settled into the chilled room, it became clear there were still pieces of the past left unspoken. Still shadows beneath the butcher's shop that hadn't yet seen daylight. And still one more secret Elric hadn't told anyone, not even himself. The stranger hesitated at the doorway, his hand resting gently on the old iron handle. The words Elric had just spoken, about a second pit, settled into the dusty air like falling ash. It was the kind of detail you didn't expect in a sleepy town, and certainly not from a man who'd gone years barely speaking to anyone. The door creaked softly as it closed again. The stranger turned, slower this time, eyes sharp but not unkind. "Where is it?" Elric didn't answer right away. He moved behind a stall, reached for a wooden crate beneath the table, and began quietly arranging it as if preparing for the next customer, though none would come this late. The steady movements of his hands seemed to say more than his silence. There was something deliberate in how he stacked bones, careful in how he wrapped meat. His whole life, after all, had been built on routines that didn't allow room for thinking too long. "Out back," Elric said finally, "under the old smokehouse." The stranger blinked. "The smokehouse that collapsed last spring?" Elric nodded. "The roof was never repaired. No one uses it now, except the cats." There was no drama in his tone, no regret, no fear. Just a tired sort of acceptance, like a man who had grown used to carrying too much. The stranger stepped away from the door and came closer, slower now. "What's in the second pit, Elric?" The butcher sighed through his nose. He looked older in the lantern light, lines deeper, eyes duller. "Memories," he said, "and things I never asked to understand." Outside, the sky was fading from blue to a smoky gray. Another day nearly gone. Another quiet night settling over crooked alleys and flickering candles. Somewhere beyond the butcher's walls, bells chimed the hour. Elric didn't count them. When the first pit filled, he said, finally looking up, "I started a second, but not for waste, not for bone. I dug it when the whispers began, when people disappeared and no one looked, not even the church. You ever wonder what happens when those with power lose it? They don't go quietly. They vanish." The stranger furrowed his brow, folding his arms. "Are you saying they were killed?" "I'm saying they weren't buried with prayers." There was no emotion in his voice, just weariness, the kind that came from years of silence, from years of pretending nothing had happened when everything had. The stranger lowered his gaze. "You carried that alone all this time?" Elric nodded once. "No one wanted to know? Not back then. Not now. Meat stayed cheap. That was all they cared about." A long moment passed between them. The sounds of the town returned slowly, distant footsteps, the cry of a baby, a dog's soft whimper. The world, unaware of the weight in this little stall, kept turning. "You were just a butcher," the man said softly. "I still am. But you saw what no one else did." Elric gave a small, dry laugh. "I see everything. That's the curse of the trade." And perhaps it was true. A butcher stood between life and death every day. He knew the look in a creature's eyes when it knew its time had come. He knew the weight of fresh blood, the warmth of a fading body. There were no illusions in his world. Just sharp knives, sharper truths, and a town too busy surviving to ask questions. The stranger looked toward the back door. "Will you show me?" Elric didn't answer at first. Instead, he walked to a small cupboard, opened it, and pulled out a dull brass key. He placed it on the table between them. "You'll need this." The man didn't move. Elric added, "It's not locked. Not anymore. But that door sticks when it's damp." The man picked up the key, weighing it in his palm. Then he looked at Elric one last time. "You don't want to come?" "I've been," Elric said. "You only need to see it once." There was something final in his voice, like a man giving his last confession. Not to be forgiven, but to be understood. The stranger nodded slowly. Then, without another word, he slipped out the back door, boots crunching softly on the stone step. The wooden door thudded shut behind him. Elric stood alone in the silence. He didn't go upstairs, didn't return to his bench. He just stood there as if waiting. Out back, the stranger moved past empty crates and cold ashes toward the ruins of the smokehouse. It was a small building, half collapsed, barely holding itself together. The door hung off one hinge. Inside, only broken beams and rusted chains. The air was thick with old smoke and damp straw. In the center of the dirt floor was a square patch of earth that looked newer than the rest. No stones, no roots, just soft, turned dirt like a wound in the ground. He knelt beside it and noticed something strange. The ground didn't just look fresh, it had been disturbed recently. Maybe days ago. He brushed away the top layer, fingers careful, slow. The soil gave way easily. And then, just beneath the surface, something appeared. Not bones, not wood, fabric, dark, worn cloth, wet from soil, smelling faintly of iron. He pulled gently, and something came loose. A sack, small, tied with string. His fingers paused on the knot, because something inside the bag moved, just slightly, and from the house, Elric, still standing at the counter, closed his eyes. He already knew what the man had found, but even after all these years, he still didn't know what it meant. The man didn't open the sack right away. Instead, he sat back on his heels, letting the cold of the dirt floor seep into his knees. He looked around the smokehouse, at the broken rafters above, the soot-blackened walls, the forgotten tools leaning in the corners like sleeping ghosts. Everything here had a story, but none of it was eager to speak. The sack in his hands was damp. Not rotten, just damp, tied with an old piece of twine that had gone stiff with time. It was heavier than it looked, but not by much. Not heavy like stone, more like something soft and recent. The man drew a breath and untied the knot. The cloth peeled back slowly, resisting just a little, like it didn't want to let go of whatever was hidden inside. For a moment, he thought it might be meat, preserved, hidden for a reason. But as the sack opened, what he found wasn't meat at all. It was parchment, dozens of rolled sheets, stuffed together like rags. Some were crumpled, torn at the edges, the ink faded to a muddy brown. Others looked newer, less worn, more deliberate. He picked one up carefully and unrolled it. It was a list. Names. Dozens of names, each with a mark beside it. Some had a cross. Some had nothing. And some, just a faint smear of red. The man's throat tightened. He unrolled another. And another. More names. Some he recognized. Old record from the town archives. People who had simply gone missing over the years. Peasants. Children. One or two officials. The kind of disappearances that had explanations, just never good ones. He looked closer at the handwriting. Neat. Simple. Efficient. It wasn't Elric's. At least, not entirely. The strokes were cleaner than a butcher's hand. Someone else had written these. Someone with education. A clerk. Or someone with reason to keep track of the town's forgotten. The man reached deeper into the sack and felt something solid. A box. Small. Wooden. He lifted it carefully from the sack and brushed the dirt off the lid. No lock. No hinges. Just a sliding cover, warped slightly by time. He opened it. Inside was a single ring. Silver, tarnished, with the crest of the town etched into it. 2 boars and a blade. A guildmaster's ring. Not decorative. Not ceremonial. This one had been worn, often. The skin beneath, it had probably blistered in summer. The man turned it over in his hand, then placed it back in the box and closed it again. He stood slowly, the sack under one arm. The pit behind him looked undisturbed again, though he hadn't bothered to cover it. There was no point now. Whatever secrets it had hidden were already rising to the surface. As he walked back through the garden gate and toward the butcher's door, he felt something shift. The town hadn't changed, but his understanding of it had. All those years, this little shop had been part of something bigger. Not a conspiracy. Not exactly. Just survival. And survival in a place like this was rarely clean. Elric was still standing where the man had left him, behind the counter, staring not at the door but past it. His eyes looked glassy now, not with tears but distance, as though his thoughts were far beyond the walls of his shop. The man stepped inside and set the sack on the table. Elric didn't speak. The man didn't push. Finally, Elric said, "You found the list." The man nodded once. "And the ring." Elric looked at him. "That ring belonged to my brother." There was a silence between them, soft and respectful. "He was a scribe," Elric said. "Worked for the alderman. One of the last honest ones." The man waited. When the town was starving, Elric continued. He started writing down the people who went missing, who they were, what they owed, where they were last seen. He didn't tell anyone, just kept notes. "And you buried them?" the man asked gently. Elric nodded. "When he died, I found them under his bed. I didn't know what to do, so I kept them. Then, when the fire came, I moved them out back. Figured they'd be safer there." He looked down at his hands. "But I couldn't throw them away. Someone needed to remember." The man sat across from him. "You remembered." Elric gave a tired shrug. "Doesn't count if no one else knows." "It does now." They sat in silence, the only sound the distant rhythm of hooves clopping past the shop. A cart headed home for the night. Somewhere in the upper rooms, a beam creaked softly, shifting in its old frame. The man ran his fingers along the sack again. "I think your brother wanted this found." "I think he did too," Elric said. "Just not by me." He looked up then, meeting the man's eyes. "You're not from here, are you?" "No, but you came looking." The man nodded. "My grandmother was on the list." That stopped Elric cold. "I never met her," the man said softly. "But my mother always said she just disappeared one winter." No explanation. She used to cry about it when she thought no one was listening. Elric stared at the table, then at the sack. "I didn't know. I figured." Neither one said anything for a while. The lantern light flickered across the room, playing on the old wooden walls, the knives, the clean bones waiting to be picked up tomorrow morning. "You can take them," Elric said at last. "The papers, the box, whatever's there." The man nodded. Then Elric added, "But leave the ring." The man looked up. Elric said, "It belongs here." The stranger reached into the sack, opened the box again, and took one last look at the silver ring. He set it gently on the counter between them. It caught the light just enough to shine, briefly, like it was remembering something too. "I'm going to write this all down," the man said. Elric didn't respond. "I won't use your name," he added. "That's not what I'm worried about." "What are you worried about?" Elric looked toward the window. "That they'll stop asking questions again. Like before." The man followed his gaze out into the darkening street. "Maybe not this time." Neither of them sounded convinced, but both wanted it to be true. By morning, the streets of the town stirred slowly, just as they had for generations. The cobblestones were the same shoes. The bread smelled the same in the market stalls. The same pigeons picked at the same crumbs dropped by the same tired hands. The town had not changed, but something in Elric had. He awoke just before dawn, as usual, with his hands already reaching for his apron before his mind had caught up. That's how habits worked. You didn't think about them. They just carried you along, especially when you're trying not to feel too much. The stall was already cool and quiet by the time he opened it. The cutting block was clean. The knives had been sharpened the night before, as always. The bone bucket was empty. There would be fresh scraps soon, he knew. But today, they felt different. Lighter, somehow. Not in weight, but in burden. He hadn't dreamed the night before, or if he had, he didn't remember. That alone was a small blessing. Most nights, the same scenes repeated. Muddy boots, long lists, faces of those he'd served, those who'd been forgotten. But this morning felt still. For the first time in years, he didn't reach for the ledger right away. Instead, he sat on the small stool behind the counter and just watched the morning light rise over the square. It caught the tops of the thatched roofs first, then slid slowly down the wooden walls and narrow chimneys. It was quiet. Even the dogs hadn't started barking yet. Then a knock. Not loud, not rushed, just a soft, careful knock at the edge of the stall. Elric turned. It was a girl, maybe 11, maybe 12. Bare feet, smudged cheeks, and a thick wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She didn't say anything, just stood there with something small in her hands. Elric leaned forward. "Can I help you?" She stepped forward and placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. He looked at it. The handwriting wasn't hers. He unfolded it slowly. Inside, a message written in tidy, looping letters. "Thank you for remembering her." Elric looked up, but the girl had already started walking away, her thin figure disappearing between the alley shadows, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. He didn't follow. He just folded the note and slipped it into his apron pocket beside the small coin pouch and the worn cloth he used to clean his blade. Some things he had learned were better kept close. Later that day, a cart pulled into town bearing salted pork and dried beans. Elric helped the driver unload it, his arms still strong despite the ache in his joints. No one said anything about the sack from the night before. No one asked about the ring. But they knew. You could feel it in the way they nodded at him now. Not fear, not reverence, just something different, like recognition. At midday, the priest came by. He didn't stay long, just blessed the stall, as he did every week, and muttered something about peace and memory. Elric offered him a cut of lamb. The priest accepted it with a quiet thanks and left. Later, two boys ran past the shop chasing a wooden hoop. One of them stopped to peek in wide-eyed. "Is it true?" he asked. Elric didn't answer, just smiled faintly and handed him a scrap of sausage. That was enough. The boy grinned and darted off. That night, Elric cleaned the counter slower than usual. Not because he was tired, but because he wasn't rushing. For once, the stall could wait. The blades could rest. There were no more secrets tucked in his sacks behind the smokehouse. Only the usual quiet of meat and memory. But as he swept the floor, something caught his eye. A small mark beneath the cutting board. A spot he hadn't noticed in years. He knelt, brushing away the sawdust. It was a carving. Not deep, not fancy, just a pair of initials. RG. His brother's name. Elric stared at it for a long time. Then, quietly, he reached for his knife, not to cut, but to add his own initials beside it. He carved slowly, carefully, like someone performing a ritual. When he was done, two sets of letters sat side by side, just under the board. He didn't say anything aloud, but the room felt fuller somehow. Not crowded, just not alone. Outside, the bells rang softly for vespers. Another day ending. Elric sat for a long while after closing the shutters, letting the dusk settle around him. His hands were still, his thoughts quiet, and for the first time in years, he felt like a butcher again. Just a butcher, not a keeper of bones or a witness to sins. Just a man with a block and a blade, and a small shop in a tired town. He could live with that, for now. But outside, beyond the butcher's walls, beyond the flicker of lanterns and the stretch of the town's sleeping arms, something was moving. The man who had come for the list was gone, left before sunrise. No one had seen where he went. But weeks later, in a village 5 days to the north, a paper was nailed to the tavern door. No name, no signature, just a list. Old names, forgotten ones, and at the bottom, 3 words, still remembering her. That was how it started. Not with shouts or torches. Not with trials or punishments. Just quiet papers, left in quiet places. And over time, the silence that had ruled the town for so long began to loosen. Just a little. Enough for people to start asking questions again. And that was more than Elric ever hoped for. But the sack, the one from under the smokehouse, had held more than names. There were other papers deeper in the stack, ones the man hadn't read before leaving. Elric had found them days later, tucked beneath the bottom layer. They weren't lists. They were letters. From someone who had known what was happening. Someone who had tried to stop it. The handwriting was familiar, but not his brother's. And in one of them, dated only a week before the scribe's death, was a single chilling line. "If I vanish, don't trust the midwife." Elric read it 3 times. The midwife had died years ago, or so they'd said. But now, for the first time in a very long time, Elric didn't feel tired. He felt curious. And maybe that was how it all began again. With a butcher, a letter, and a name he wasn't ready to forget. For the next few days, Elric did what he always did. He chopped, measured, salted, cleaned. The townsfolk came and went, offering coin for cuts and nods for greetings. It was a rhythm, familiar, repetitive, safe. But in the back of his mind, the letter echoed. Don't trust the midwife. It shouldn't have mattered. The midwife, old Marta, had been gone for nearly 10 years. A fever took her, they'd said. Quick, like most things that swept through the alley homes that winter. No one questioned it. She was old, frail, quiet, not the kind of woman who left questions behind. But Elric remembered her. She had sharp eyes, even when her hands trembled. She never smiled much, but when she did, it wasn't kind. More like she was amused by something only she could see. She had delivered half the town at one point or another. Half the town, and maybe more. And now he couldn't stop thinking. What did she know? On the third morning, he went to the church archives. It was a dusty room behind the chapel, lined with wooden shelves and old scrolls. The priest gave him a strange look when he asked for access, but said nothing. Elric lit a candle and started going through the birth and death records. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe something out of place. An inconsistency. A pattern. At first, nothing stood out. But then he noticed a column delivered by beside the birth dates. Marta's name appeared often. Too often. Dozens of births over a span of 20 years. Then suddenly it stopped. Just before the famine. Right around the time his brother started writing names. Elric scanned further. Some births had no midwife listed at all. Some were marked only by an X. And some children simply disappeared from the records after their first month. No death entry. No burial fee. Nothing. He rubbed his eyes and leaned back. The candle flickered, casting the shelves in long, wavy shadows. He thought again about the pit behind the smokehouse. The missing names. The children no one ever mentioned. A quiet unease settled in his chest. That evening, as he salted a fresh leg of mutton, he kept hearing a voice in his head. His brother's voice, steady and calm, as it used to be. Write everything down, even if no one believes it now. Elric didn't sleep that night. He didn't lie down or even sit. He stayed at the counter, sharpening a blade he had already sharpened twice that day. At sunrise, he closed the stall for the first time in years. A wooden sign on the door read, "Gone to market." But he didn't go to the market. He went to the old healer's cottage on the far edge of the town. The cottage was falling apart. Ivy choked the chimney. The front door hung on one hinge, but the inside was still dry, and under a loose board in the floor, he found what he'd suspected, a collection of old ledgers. Midwife logs, thin books wrapped in cloth, hidden from whoever came to clean out the cottage after Marta died. Or maybe no one had bothered to clean it at all. He opened the first one. It was written in Marta's hand, sharp, angular script with little room for emotion. Birth weights, mother's names, health notes. But some pages had margins filled with cryptic marks. He flipped through them slowly. Then, near the center of the second book, he saw it. A name. Rowena G. His mother. And under that, child lost. No remains. But Elric remembered that day. He remembered her holding a child. A girl. His sister. Only for a few hours, yes, but not stillborn. Not lost. Alive. He clenched the edge of the ledger until the pages crinkled beneath his fingers. There were other names like that. Dozens. Babies marked as lost, with no record of burial. Elric sat back, feeling cold despite the afternoon sun streaming through the cracked windows. He didn't know what Marta had been part of. He didn't want to, but now he had to. Back at the shop, he placed the ledgers beside the sack from the pit. For the first time, he looked at them not as scattered pieces of something broken, but as parts of a whole. A quiet story, a quiet crime, hidden behind birth sheets and bone scraps. He pulled out a blank parchment and dipped his quill. It was time to start his own record. He didn't know how far it would go, or what it would change, but he wrote anyway, because he remembered now what it was like to be the one who watched, the one who knew. That night, a storm rolled through town. The wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling shutters and carrying bits of straw down the alleys. Most people stayed inside, fires burning low and quiet. Elric didn't light a fire. He sat in the dark, the ledgers open before him, listening to the rain. There was something comforting about storms. They reminded him that the world still moved, that nothing stayed hidden forever. The next morning, someone had slipped a note under the butcher's door. Just 5 words. You're not the only one. No name, no signature. But the handwriting was different than the last. This one was shaky, maybe old, maybe scared. He folded it and placed it with the rest. The sack, the ledgers, the records. The storm had stirred more than the air. It had stirred memories. Now the butcher wasn't the only one remembering. And that made all the difference. Even if no one ever spoke it aloud. Even if the town pretended, as always, that nothing had changed. The town itself had always been the kind of place people passed through without remembering. It wasn't marked on every map. Travelers might stop for a night, trade a few coins for bread and ale, and be on their way before dawn. But for those who lived there, the silence wasn't just normal, it was expected. Things were simply not talked about. And over time, that silence became as strong as the stones in the street. But Elric had started to hear something different in that quiet. A whisper under the hush, a gap in the rhythm, something that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. Each morning, he returned to the old midwife's ledgers, reading slowly by candlelight before unlocking his stall. Some entries were clear, dates, names, clean records of life beginning. But others had gaps, scratches in the ink, places where words had been blotted out or never written at all. It wasn't just carelessness. It felt like something had been removed deliberately. The deeper he read, the more he saw the pattern. It wasn't about every child or every mother. It was specific, intentional. Certain families had been touched again and again, while others had been spared entirely. The names weren't random. One afternoon, he decided to visit an old friend of his brother's, Brother Aldwin, a monk who had once served as a scribe at the priory on the hill. He was nearly blind now, but his mind was still sharp. Elric brought a cut of dried beef wrapped in cloth as a gift. Aldwin accepted it gratefully, then leaned close when Elric unrolled one of the pages with the scratched-out names. "I remember this," Aldwin murmured. His fingers traced the edge of the page, slowly. They used to come late at night, when no one was meant to be there. Women with anxious eyes. Always alone. Always in silence. He paused. "I wasn't meant to ask questions, so I didn't. But one night, I saw Marta outside, talking to someone." "Who?" Elric asked. Aldwin tilted his head. "A man in a cloak. Not a priest. Not a healer. Someone official. He didn't belong here, and he didn't stay long. But after that, things changed. The birth stopped being recorded honestly. Some children were taken away before the mothers even held them. Marta said it was illness. But they weren't sick. They were strong." Elric said nothing, just listened. Every piece was adding weight to something he still couldn't fully name. Before he left, Aldwin touched his hand. They kept records outside of the church, too. The guilds. The keepers of the poorhouse. If anything is left, it'll be there. Back in a butcher's stall, Elric stared at the knife in his hand. Not because he meant to use it, but because it reminded him of something simple. The truth was always in the cut. Whether meat or story, something hidden was always revealed when you slice carefully. The poorhouse was a gray building at the edge of town, always smelling of boiled grain and damp straw. It had been there since before Elric was born. Most people avoided it. It reminded them of how close they lived to ruin. Elric asked the keeper, an old woman with brittle hair and no patience, if she kept any logs. She hesitated at first, but when Elric offered her a few wrapped cuts of salted meat, she softened. She returned with a small chest, dusty and locked. The key hung around her neck. Inside were notebooks, thin, cracking with age. And there, pressed between 2 dry pages, was a list: children given into care, children taken for treatment, children relocated. But the strangest thing was this. Many of the names had no exit date. No left by relative. No died of fever. Just a line. Blank. He turned another page and saw a strange symbol stamped in the margin next to a name he recognized. Martin Hale. That had been the boy who lived across the alley from Elric when they were children. Quiet, always alone. Then one day gone. No one ever spoke of it. Just vanished. And now his name sat here, marked by a strange little insignia, a triangle within a circle, barely visible under the faded ink. Elric stared at the symbol. It didn't belong to the poorhouse, nor the church, nor the guild. He had never seen it before. And yet, there was something about it that felt familiar, like it had passed through the hands of many and had been scrubbed from memory only halfway. That night, he dreamed of smoke and crying. Not sharp sobs, but muffled sounds, like someone trying not to be heard. When he woke up, the sweat clung to his skin, and the feeling of being watched lingered just behind his shoulders. The following morning, a new note appeared beneath his door. No signature, just "Do not speak the symbol aloud." He stared at it for a long time. Then, without thinking, burned it in the cooking fire before starting the day's work. That afternoon, an old man came to the stall. He didn't buy anything. He simply nodded once and left a pouch of coins on the counter with no explanation. As he turned to walk away, he said softly, "You're not wrong. Just careful." It was a strange kind of warning, or a blessing. Elric wasn't sure. The next few days, the shop felt different. He still worked, still chopped and sold and salted. But more people came not just for meat, but for glances, for quiet exchanges, for the feeling that something unspoken had begun to stir in the town's stillness. He hadn't meant to start anything, but people talk, even when they whisper, and whispers carry further than shouts when the world is quiet enough. Then came a knock late one night. Not a customer, not a beggar, a girl barely older than the first, pale with frightened eyes and dried blood on her sleeve. "They took my sister," she said. Elric let her in. He gave her water, let her sit by the small fire behind the stall. She told him what she saw. 2 men in brown cloaks, a woman in white with gloves, a child crying in a cloth. The cart left through the East Road at midnight. No one else had seen, or no one else had dared to say. When she finished speaking, Elric handed her a blanket and told her to sleep. He sat beside the door and didn't close his eyes once. Something old was moving again, not in the open, but underground, like roots stretching, reaching for breath. He had touched it, and now was touching back. Let me know when you're ready for the next 1,000 words. The story will continue to deepen the mystery while keeping the tone soft and sleep-friendly, full of subtle intrigue, human moments, and emotional texture ideal for relaxed nighttime listening. By the morning, the girl was gone. She left no note, no sound, just the folded blanket resting on the bench and a shallow indentation where she'd slept. Elric didn't chase after her. Something told him she wouldn't be found unless she wanted to be. But she'd left something else behind, one small braid of hair tied with red thread, tucked beside the fire. It wasn't a message, not in words, but it felt like a kind of trust, or maybe a reminder. The red thread caught the light in the most curious way, like it didn't belong in this world of soot and meat and gray stone. He wrapped it carefully in cloth and placed it in the wooden box where he was keeping the ledgers, the notes, and a marked page from the poorhouse. It was getting harder to separate the ordinary days from the quiet dread underneath them. Elric still cut meat, still poured salt and scrubbed blood from his boots. But every face in a market now seemed like it was pretending not to see what was happening, pretending not to know that people disappeared. The worst part was how normal everything looked. He thought about Marta again, the old midwife with the quiet hands. Maybe she hadn't started it. Maybe she was just a part of the machinery. One cog in something older, deeper, more organized. She had known something, had been trusted with something, and in the end, it had likely killed her. Or maybe she'd vanished, too. People only said she died. No one saw a grave. One evening, Elric took a walk past the chapel and followed the path through the trees behind the cemetery. It wasn't a place many people visited. The trees grew thick and close together, and the roots jutted from the ground like broken fingers. As he walked, he noticed shapes, small markers, uncarved stones, some leaning against trees, some half swallowed by earth. No names, no years, just stone. He paused at one where a small bunch of dried flowers had been tied to a branch above it. The flowers were brittle with age, their petals curled. Someone had been there once. Someone who remembered, or mourned, or both. The wind rustled the leaves above him. He didn't stay long. The next day, a boy came to the stall. Not to buy, not even to speak. He just stood across the counter and stared with wide, uncertain eyes. Elric leaned forward. Do you need something? The boy opened his mouth, then closed it. Then slowly he raised his hand. It was a small leather charm. Old, cracked at the corners but still intact. Sewn into it was that same symbol, a triangle within a circle. Elric's breath caught in his throat. Where did you get that? The boy didn't answer. Instead, he placed it gently on the counter, turned, and walked away into the crowd. Elric picked up the charm and studied it closely. The leather was worn, but the stitching was deliberate, precise. This wasn't something made in passing. It had been crafted, given meaning, maybe even issued. He turned it over, half expecting more marks, but there was only a small hole, like it had once been hung around someone's neck. Back in the quiet of the shop, he placed the charm next to the red thread and the other clues. His box of silence, he called it now, a collection of things no one else seemed to see. It was getting heavier. He began writing at night, not just records of meat sold or coin exchanged, but memories. The name of every child he remembered seeing vanish. Every strange mark. Every whispered story. Not for anyone else. Not yet. But he knew that if he didn't write them down, they might slip away like the rest. Like his brother had. He remembered how his brother had been obsessed with patterns. He'd draw them in the dirt, in the fogged-up windows, on pieces of cloth when no one was looking. Now Elric wondered if those shapes had been warnings. Maybe he'd seen this coming. Maybe he tried to speak, and no one listened. One day, a traveling tinker stopped by the stall and traded a small iron pan for a few links of sausage. As he packed up, he glanced toward Elric and said, almost casually, "You still got the pit behind the smokehouse?" Elric froze. What pit? The tinker raised an eyebrow. Big round one, covered in old boards. Thought that was where you dump bones. Elric hadn't told anyone about the pit. Not recently. Not since he found the sack. He shook his head slowly. That was sealed up years ago. The tinker nodded. Funny. Looked fresh to me last week when I passed through at night. Smelled fresh, too. He tipped his hat and walked off. Elric's stomach turned. That night, he lit a lantern and went behind the smokehouse. The boards were still in place. He hadn't disturbed them since that first day. But when he knelt and pulled one up, the smell hit him again, fresh, sharp, and unmistakably wrong. Someone had been here. Recently. Someone else knew. He replaced the board carefully and stepped back into the shadows, listening. But the night was quiet. No footsteps. No movement. Still, he knew. He wasn't alone anymore. Whether that meant he had allies or was being watched, he couldn't say. The next day, the priest came to visit. He wasn't a man who liked meat. He'd always been polite but distant. Yet now, he stood in the doorway of the stall with his hands folded and his eyes heavy. I hear you've been looking into old things, the priest said. Elric nodded once. Just family records. The priest glanced behind him, then stepped inside. Be careful, Elric. The past doesn't stay buried just because you dig it up gently. Elric said nothing. I don't know what you found, the priest continued, but I do know this. What happened then still scares the wrong people now. And scared people are dangerous. He handed Elric a small folded cloth. Inside was a medallion. Silver. Faintly tarnished. The same symbol etched into it. Triangle. Circle. Below it, barely visible, the letters VT. Elric looked up, but the priest was already walking away. No explanation. No blessing. Just a silent warning. That evening, Elric sat beside the fire, the box open at his feet, all the pieces laid out in front of him. The ledger, the hair, the charm, the medallion, and the question that wouldn't leave him. What were they trying to cover up? The days began to blur. Morning light filtered through the old shutters like it always had, and yet Elric woke with a growing weight in his chest. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something quieter, like walking on soft ground and knowing, somewhere beneath the surface, there was a hollow waiting to collapse. He still worked, still chopped meat and wrapped parcels, still greeted customers with a faint smile. But his eyes kept wandering to the woods beyond the chapel, to the alley where Marn and Hale once played, to the crack in the stone near the door where he'd hidden the medallion for safekeeping. He had started to notice things. A man who passed the shop 3 times in the same hour. A woman who stared a little too long at the window, her basket empty. The sound of hoofbeats stopping just short of the square at night, then turning back into the dark. These weren't accidents. They were rehearsed, measured. Someone was watching, and they wanted him to know it. He returned to the poorhouse, once more under the excuse of donating a small bag of bone scraps for the dogs. The old keeper accepted them without a word, but her eyes narrowed when he asked to see the chest again. "It's not here," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "It was 2 weeks ago," Elric replied gently. She turned toward the back room. "That was before we were told to clean up." "By who?" She hesitated, then said softly, "Not someone from here." He waited, but she didn't say more. Just looked past him toward the street, as if worried someone else was listening. He thanked her and left, but that visit stuck with him. The chest was gone. The records were likely burnt. The trail, at least from that end, had been quietly erased. But they were too late. He'd already copied what he needed, already etched it into memory. That night, he met with Aldwin again, bringing bread and a bit of dried meat. The monk seemed tired, his breathing thin. "I remember something else," Aldwin said, voice low. "There was a woman who came often, always alone, and always just after sunset. She never gave her name, but she had a birthmark on her neck, shaped like a crescent moon. One night, she came in bleeding, said her child had been taken during the night. Not dead, taken." "Did she say who?" Elric asked. Aldwin nodded. "No names, but she kept repeating the same letters. VT, 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 like a prayer or a curse. I don't know what it meant. I thought she was mad." Elric thought of the medallion again. The silver, the letters. "They told me later she died in the river," Aldwin said, "but no one saw a body." Elric sat in silence beside the old monk, feeling the flicker of the candle between them cast strange shadows across the wall. Later that night, back at the shop, he opened the hidden panel on the floor near the hearth, something his father had once used to keep coins safe during lean winters. It wasn't large, but it was deep enough. Inside, he placed the red thread, the medallion, the charm, and the notes. Carefully, precisely. Then he added a scrap of cloth, torn from the cloak the strange girl had worn. He didn't know why he kept it, only that something told him not to throw it away. That same night, someone scratched a mark into his door. At first, he thought it was a nail or a tool, but when he examined it closely, his stomach dropped. It wasn't random. It was the symbol again, triangle within a circle, but reversed, carved roughly as if in haste. He didn't sleep. He didn't open the door the next morning either. Not until the sun was well over the rooftops. When he finally stepped outside, the mark was still there, untouched, and no one around him said a word about it. The people who passed his stall that day were quiet, eyes a little more cautious. One woman, an old customer who used to bring her grandson for bones to feed their hound, whispered under her breath. They used to do that. Long ago, before the snow years. "Do what?" Elric asked. She hesitated, then glanced around, marked the doors of those who asked questions. And then, they stopped asking. The woman didn't return again. For a few days, things were still. Elric worked in silence, kept his thoughts to himself. But the tension didn't fade. It only pressed harder, like something beneath the floorboards waiting to be let out. And then, late one afternoon, a letter appeared. Not handed to him, not delivered by courier. Just there, folded neatly on the counter inside his shop after he'd stepped out back to fetch a pail of water. No seal, no name, just 3 lines. "The child you seek is not gone. The place you fear is not forgotten. Meet us at the edge when the bell strikes once." The ink was smudged, like the letter had been written in haste or with trembling hands. He didn't need to ask what bell. The town's old watchtower hadn't rung in years. But if it rang again, even once, it would be heard across every cobbled path, every dusty window, every field. Elric folded the letter, slipped it into his apron, and waited. That night, the wind howled strangely, as if the town itself were holding its breath. And in the dead hour, when even the dogs had gone quiet and the torches by the gate burned low, the bell rang. Once, just once. Elric didn't wait. He wrapped himself in his cloak, took the old knife he'd kept sharpened for decades, and stepped into the night. He walked quickly, but not carelessly, past the chapel, past the row of abandoned carts by the tannery. through the overgrown path behind the graveyard, until he reached the edge. There, in the moonlight, stood 3 figures. One of them stepped forward, pulled back her hood. It was the girl with the braid. She was no longer afraid. Elric opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand. Behind her, the second figure removed his hood, revealing the gaunt, weathered face of a man Elric had once seen in his brother's old sketches. The third didn't move, just stood still, silent, watching, and then the girl whispered, "You weren't meant to remember. But you do." Elric nodded slowly. She pointed to the woods behind them. "There's something buried they want kept quiet. It's not just bones. It's truth, and truth makes them weak." Elric looked past her, into the trees. The wind stirred. Something waited in the dark. He stepped forward. The story wasn't over. Not yet. Elric followed them in silence. The path through the woods was old and twisted, littered with broken branches and the soft sound of dried leaves underfoot. No one spoke. The girl led, the older man walked just behind her, and the silent figure stayed at the back, close enough to watch, far enough to never quite be heard breathing. They moved like people who had walked this way many times, like ghosts retracing a memory. The moonlight filtered through the trees in patches, silver and flickering, and the deeper they went, the quieter the world seemed to grow. Even the wind held its breath here. Elric's heart beat louder than he liked. Not out of fear, though some of that lingered, but out of the quiet knowing that something was waiting for him. Something old. Something he should have seen long ago. After what felt like half an hour, they reached a clearing. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakably shaped. Perfectly round, unnaturally so. The grass in the center was dry and low, though the forest around it pressed in thick and wild. At the center of the clearing, partially covered in moss and soil, was a wide, flat stone. The girl stopped and turned. "This is where it started," she said softly. "Long before the stall. Long before the smokehouse. Long before you knew." Elric stepped closer to the stone. Even under the moss, he could see carvings. Faint but deliberate. Circles. Triangles. Lines and dots. Patterns, not letters. Like a language from someone who never spoke with words. He knelt, brushed some of the moss away with careful fingers. It was a gathering sight, the older man said behind him, for those who weren't welcome in the towns. Healers, midwives, story keepers. They met here to share what they knew. And then one winter, they vanished. Elric looked up. All of them. The man nodded. All. Some say the town did it to stop them. Others say something darker got there first. The girl stepped beside Elric. Her voice was soft and steady. They weren't evil. They were just different. And difference, back then, was dangerous. He traced one of the carvings slowly, letting the tip of his finger follow the curves. There was something familiar in the shape, something like the marks his brother had once etched into a wooden plate and buried under the hearth when he was barely 10. At the time, Elric had laughed at him. Now he wondered what his brother had seen. The girl knelt too. She pulled something from her pocket, a torn bit of parchment, old and creased. She unfolded it and placed it on the stone beside Elric's hand. It was a sketch of the same symbols. "I found this in the priest's chambers," she said, hidden behind a book of sermons. I don't think he meant for anyone to find it, but he was studying this, maybe even protecting it. Elric looked at the lines again, the triangle within the circle repeated near the bottom corner. "What does it mean?" "No one knows anymore," the older man said. "That's the danger. When we forget what things mean, others give them their own." The third figure remained in the shadows. Then finally he spoke. His voice was dry, low, like stone cracking under pressure. "Someone in your town is using the old ways for something else. Something twisted. That's why the children go missing. That's why the bones end up where they shouldn't." Elric turned toward him. "Who?" The silence stretched. And then the girl said, "We think it's not just one person. We think it's a group." Elric's blood turned cold. "How many? We don't know. But they mark the ones they want. And they've marked you." He remembered the scratch on his door. Not a random scar, but a symbol, an invitation, or a warning. The older man reached into his cloak and handed Elric a small bundle wrapped in black cloth. Inside was a pendant, wood, not silver, etched with the same symbol again, but this time crossed through with a jagged slash. "Wear this," the man said. "It won't protect you, but it will tell others you've been warned. And it might give them pause. Elric stared at it. What do they want with the children? He asked. Why take them? The girl's voice dropped to a whisper. Some believe the old rituals bring power. That fear can be harvested. That blood can make the weak strong. Elric felt sick. And the others believe they think they're doing something good, keeping the balance, preventing worse things. The older man added, either way, it always starts the same, with silence, with forgetting, with people pretending not to see. The wind stirred the trees above them. Elric stood slowly, pendant clutched in one hand, the sketch in the other. What do I do now? The girl looked up at him. Her eyes were tired but steady. You remember. You write. You stay awake. And you watch. He nodded. They led him back through the woods in silence. The path seemed shorter this time, or maybe his mind was spinning too fast to count steps. When they reached the edge of town again, the girl turned to him. We'll be near, she said, but we won't come back unless you call. He understood. She handed him one final thing, a small pouch, heavy with something that clinked faintly when it moved. If you find another mark, she said, sprinkle this in the corners of the room. It won't stop them, but they'll know you know. Then the three of them melted into the trees, gone before he could ask another question. Elric stood there for a long time before returning to the shop. That night, he didn't light a fire. He sat in the dark with the sketch, the pendant, and the pouch on the table in front of him. Somewhere outside, a cart rolled by. Farther off, an owl called once, then went quiet. And in the deepest hour before dawn, just as his eyes began to close, he heard it again. The slow creak of a wooden door. Not his, but nearby, somewhere in the town, somewhere too close. He did not sleep. The butcher had become a watcher, and the real story was only just beginning. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the town felt different. Nothing visible had changed, yet Elric moved through the cobbled streets with a strange heaviness in his steps, as if the ground beneath him remembered secrets he was only beginning to learn. People still bustled about with their bread baskets, carts still creaked over uneven stones, and the bell of the monastery still rang out the hours. But in all of it, Elric noticed the spaces in between. The glances exchanged too quickly, the silences that lingered a little too long. He opened his shop like usual, laid out the meats, sharpened the knives, smiled at the old man who always came by for marrow bones, and at the widow who bought liver for her cat. But all the while, he kept one eye on the alley, on the door, on the rooftops. When a noon hour passed, a boy came in, barefoot, hair tangled, face smudged with dirt. He didn't speak, only pointed to a basket of scraps. Elric gave him some without question, dropping them into a cloth and handing them over gently. As the boy turned to leave, Elric noticed something strange. On the back of the boy's neck, just below the hairline, was a faint smudge. A mark, circular. Elric stepped around the counter. Wait. But the boy was already gone, darting into the sunlit street, disappearing into the crowd like a drop into water. Elric rushed to the door, but by the time he looked both ways, the boy had vanished. He stood in the doorway longer than he meant to, holding the edge of the frame, the wood warm under his fingers. That mark, it hadn't been dirt. It had been drawn, on purpose, a circle within a circle. Later that day, he visited the candle maker, an old friend named Berta, whose stall was near the river bend. She'd always been good at spotting what others missed, and she had a way of knowing things without claiming to know them. He asked her, casually at first, if she'd seen the barefoot boy. Her hand stilled as she dipped a wick into warm wax. I've seen him, she said, now and then. Does he have family? She shook her head. He used to. Mother was a seamstress. Quiet woman. Died last winter. What about the mark on his neck? Berta didn't look up. Some of the orphans have them. Said it's a game. Said it keeps them safe. Elric frowned. From who? This time she looked at him. Her eyes were kind, but tired. From the ones who visit at night. That night, Elric did not sleep again. He sat by the window with the candle burning low, watching the shadows shift along the narrow street. Around midnight, he saw movement, a shape slinking between doorways, moving faster than a drunk, slower than a thief. He stood quickly and pressed against the glass. The shape stopped in front of the cobbler's home, looked around. then bent down. When it rose again, it was holding something small and dark. A pouch. Then it walked away without hurry. Elric stepped outside, heart pounding. At the cobbler's door, he found it, another mark. This one fresher. Not carved, but smeared in something thick and sticky. Blood, or something meant to look like it. He wiped it away quickly and returned to his shop, locking the door behind him. In the morning, he visited the cobbler under the guise of needing a repair for an old boot. Inside, everything seemed normal. The cobbler greeted him with a laugh and offered cider. But Elric's eyes searched the room. No signs of struggle, no strange objects. Still, he felt the shift. The game had begun. That evening, he returned to the hidden panel near the hearth, removed the pouch the girl had given him, and scattered a pinch of the fine gray powder in each corner of the shop. It smelled faintly like ash and herbs. Calming, almost. He didn't know what it did, but it made him feel less alone. Days passed, and more letters came. Not every night, but enough to make his heart race each time he spotted one, tucked between slabs of mutton, slipped into his apron while he turned, folded beneath the cutting board. They were all unsigned, but each gave a clue. The mayor knew. Asked the apothecary what's buried under the shop. The bell tower holds more than bells. The writing changed with each note, different hands, different ink, but the message was clear. Someone or several someones were pushing him forward. Elric followed the trail cautiously. He spoke to the apothecary, an old woman with a spine like a broomstick and fingers that trembled when she poured. She admitted the shop was once a watch station, long ago, with a tunnel sealed beneath it. Said it led to a stone vault no one could open. The mayor, when asked innocently about the old town records, grew cold. His eyes shifted toward the window as he said, "Some things are best forgotten. Don't go poking." The bell tower, when visited one gray afternoon, smelled of damp rope and mold. But high above, in the room where the great bell hung silent, Elric found something odd. Another symbol, carved deeply into the beam. And beside it, scratched in with a knife, the word 3. He took that word back with him, wrote it down on a fresh page beside the others. One word, one clue, each added up like pieces of a puzzle, still missing its edges. And then came the dream. He was back in a clearing, standing at the stone. The girl was gone, and the older man was silent. Only the third figure stood across from him. This time, the figure stepped closer, removed his hood, and Elric saw himself. Older, thinner with hollow eyes. "I tried to stop it," the dream him whispered, "but I waited too long." Then the clearing turned black, and he woke, sweating, heart pounding. The next morning, the cobbler's shop didn't open. By noon, word spread that he hadn't been seen since the night before. Elric walked to the house with dread coiling in his stomach. Inside, everything looked untouched, except the back door was wide open. And in the kitchen, etched into the wall above the table, was the mark again. This time not drawn, burned into the wood. Elric stood at the burned symbol, his hand hovering inches from the blackened wood. It was still warm, as if the fire hadn't quite gone out. There was no smell of smoke, no ash on the floor, and yet the mark glowed faintly in the morning light like a warning freshly written. Something had been here, not long ago, and whoever, or whatever, it was hadn't been in a hurry. It had left the door open on purpose. He looked around the cobbler's home again, slower this time. On the surface, it was all ordinary. A pot half full of stew still sat on the hearth, spoons left out, chairs tucked in like someone meant to return. But the silence pressed in tightly, and Elric's skin crawled with the sense that the house had been emptied of something more than just its owner. He stepped outside and walked back through the town in silence. People moved past him in their usual rhythm, but every footstep sounded louder than it should. Every greeting from a neighbor felt just a second too slow. He caught a glimpse of the barefoot boy again near the baker's alley, this time watching Elric with unblinking eyes. And when Elric turned, the boy vanished into the crowd, leaving only a dirty handprint on the corner post where he had leaned. By evening, word had settled over the town like a low fog. The cobbler had vanished. Some whispered he had run away. Others claimed they saw a dark figure near his home late the night before. But no one went inside. No one cleaned the mark. No one talked above a whisper. Elric returned to his shop and locked the door. Then he lit 3 candles, one on each windowsill, one on the counter. He didn't know if it meant anything, but the number had shown up more than once now. The words scratched into the bell tower. The marks on the parchment from the girl. 3 always returned. That night, the dream came again. But this time, he wasn't alone in the clearing. The girl stood beside him, older now, her hair longer, streaked with gray. She didn't speak, just pointed toward the stone. And when Elric looked down, he saw names etched into its surface. His name, the cobbler's, and one more he hadn't heard in years, Father Branwell, the priest who had vanished when Elric was a boy. Everyone had assumed he'd died on the road during a winter storm. But now, standing in that dream, Elric remembered the last time he'd seen the priest. He had been speaking with Elric's father outside the old smokehouse, pointing toward the hills. Elric had watched from the window. The next day, both the priest and his father had stopped speaking to each other. A week later, the priest disappeared. He woke with the name burning in his thoughts. At dawn, Elric walked to the small chapel at the far end of the town. It was rarely used anymore, mostly visited by the older folk who still remembered the old prayers. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, and the smell of wax and dust greeted him like an old memory. The current priest, a young man barely older than Elric had been when he started butchering, looked up from a bench near the altar. "Strange time to visit," he said, setting down a book. Elric nodded. "I was wondering if you kept any of Father Branwell's old things." The priest tilted his head. "He's been gone nearly 20 years. There's a chest in the back room, things no one wanted to throw away. You're welcome to look." In the small back room behind the chapel, Elric found the chest beneath a threadbare cloak and some rotted hymn books. It creaked open, heavy and stiff. Inside, a mess of letters, old robes, a rusted crucifix, and, at the bottom, a small leather-bound notebook with the initials BF pressed into the cover. He opened it slowly. The writing inside was tight, crowded, written in the old style. But the first page caught his eye. "There are things in this town that never made it into sermons, and I believe they are watching." He turned page after page. Observations, sketches, names. None made sense at first, but then he spotted symbols, repeated again and again in the margins. Circles within circles, slashes, shapes that twisted if stared at too long, and phrases. They speak in dreams. "The children know before we do. If marked, protect the corners." At the very back of the journal was a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with time and sealed with wax now brittle and crumbling. Inside, a single sentence. "It returns every 3rd generation. It always begins with the butcher." Elric sat back on his heels, blood pounding in his ears. Was this what his brother had meant? Was this what his father had feared? The thought dug deep. He left the chapel with the journal under his arm and the sun barely above the rooftops. As he walked, he noticed something else, posters on doors. Chalk drawings, each subtle. But now, with the journal in hand, he could see the pattern. Triads, groups of 3, 3 lines under shop signs, 3 dots on a child's toy, 3 knots in a rope tied oddly on a fence post. Messages, or warnings. Back at his shop, he placed the journal beside the sketch the girl had given him. Together, they formed a kind of map, a trail of old truths hidden in plain sight. He circled names, drew lines, listed the disappearances, the vanished priest, the cobbler, the boy's mother, even his own brother, who had left the town without a word years ago and never returned. A knock at the door startled him. When he opened it, the barefoot boy stood there again, holding something wrapped in cloth. He handed it over wordlessly and turned to go. Elric unwrapped it. Inside was a small wooden toy, a carving of a butcher's knife, crude but unmistakable, and burned into the handle, the circle symbol. Elric looked up to call out to the boy, but he was gone. The street was empty. Just then, a crow landed on the sign above the shop. It let out a single caw, then flew off again. Elric stepped back inside, the toy knife in one hand, the journal in the other. He didn't know who else was watching. He didn't know how many had vanished before him. But the story was no longer just about survival. It was about remembering, and remembering was starting to become dangerous. Elric didn't sleep that night, not because he was scared, though fear definitely sat in the back of his mind like a quiet guest, but because something in him had shifted. This was no longer just strange symbols or vanishing neighbors. The puzzle had taken form, a pattern, a rhythm, even, and now he needed to know how far back it went. He laid everything out on the counter: the journal from the chapel, the sketch from the girl, the letters he had kept, the toy knife, all different pieces of a larger story, one hidden beneath the surface of everyday life for years, possibly generations. And in the middle of it all, the butcher. His trade had always seemed like hard, dirty work, yes, but not important in any grand way. Yet here it was, always mentioned, always circled back to in the oldest writings. And then there was the line, "It always begins with the butcher." He didn't know if that meant him specifically or someone before him. His father had been quiet, withdrawn toward the end. There had been nights Elric woke to the sound of hushed voices, arguments near the back door, and mornings when his father stood staring at the smokehouse like he'd seen something he couldn't explain. The next morning, Elric walked to the southern edge of town, toward the old burial fields. Most people didn't go there unless they had to, especially now that the new churchyard was in use. But Elric needed to find something, anything, that could connect the names in the journal to the families still in the town. Maybe the pattern repeated itself through bloodlines. The old headstones were barely readable. Some had crumbled into the grass. Others leaned sideways like they were trying to flee. But Elric scanned each one patiently. He carried a folded page from Branwell's journal with a list of names, strange ones, faded ones. Every time he found a match, he marked it with a small stone. About halfway through the row, he found a grave that stopped him. Here lies Aldrich Funn, his grandfather. Elric knelt slowly. His grandfather had died when Elric was a boy. He remembered a warm voice, calloused hands, and a habit of humming while sharpening knives. But he'd also remembered stories, strange ones, about shadows in the fog, and bells that rang when no one was near the tower. Stories Elric's father always dismissed. Now, those tales felt more like warnings. He looked at the grave next to it. No name, just a worn stone with a faint trace of a symbol carved in the corner. Circles again. Someone else had been buried next to Aldrich, and someone had marked it. He left the field in silence. Back at the shop, the day moved slowly. People came and went, but their faces blurred together. Elric couldn't focus on anything beyond the growing feeling that the town itself was watching him, like its walls remembered things its people had forgotten. As he swept the floor late that afternoon, the door creaked open. He turned, expecting a customer. It was the girl, older than before, maybe 15 now, hair darker, expression quieter. She stepped in, closed the door behind her, and stood there like she'd been here before. "I can't stay long," she said softly. "But they're coming again." "Who?" Elric asked, stepping closer. "They come in threes," she whispered. "Always threes. Always after the mark shows up again." She reached into her cloak and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to him. Elric opened it slowly. It was a map. Not the whole town, just the alleys, back streets, and hidden pathways. On it, 3XS had been marked. One near the bell tower, one at the old mill, one right outside his shop. He looked up, but she was already opening the door. "Wait," he called after her. "Why me? Why the butcher?" She paused for just a second. "Because the butcher feeds the town," she said, "and the town feeds them." And then she was gone again. Elric locked the door, heart pounding. Her words echoed in his head. The butcher feeds the town, and the town feeds them. What did that mean? He sat at the counter and studied the map until the candle burned low. He marked the spots she gave him on a fresh sheet and added notes beside them. Places where disappearances had happened. Places where symbols were found. Places the journal mentioned but didn't explain. Everything lined up. They formed a triangle. He didn't know much about symbols or sacred geometry or anything like that. But it was hard to ignore how clean it all looked. Too clean to be coincidence. That night, he visited the first spot, the bell tower. He waited until the moon was high and the town had gone still. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and river mist. He wrapped himself in a dark cloak, slipped out the back door, and moved through the alleys without a sound. The bell tower loomed like a broken tooth in the night. He hadn't been up there since his last visit, when he found the number carved in the beam. But now, with the girl's map in hand, he looked beneath the stairs. He brushed away moss and dirt until his hand hit wood. A trapdoor. It took a minute to force it open. Inside was a narrow tunnel, cramped and musty. The air inside smelled ancient, like wet stone and forgotten promises. He lit a lantern and stepped down, the walls brushing his shoulders. The tunnel stretched longer than he expected. He followed it in silence until it opened into a circular chamber. He stopped. At the center of the floor, someone had drawn a large symbol. Circles, overlapping, with 3 knives placed at even intervals around it. On the far wall, words had been carved into the stone. The blood remembers what the mind forgets. He knelt, touching one of the knives. Old, rusted, but it still had weight, still felt dangerous. Then he heard it, a sound behind him, a scrape. He turned, but no one was there, only the tunnel. And yet he knew he wasn't alone. He took the map and left the chamber, heart racing. Back in the shop, he closed every window, sealed every door, and lit every candle he owned. Then he placed the toy knife beside the real one from the tunnel. Same shape, same size. Someone had made it as a warning, or maybe a promise. And still, the question haunted him. What exactly was he feeding? He hadn't changed anything about his trade. Animals came in, meat went out. And yet, what if that wasn't all? What if something else passed through his hands? What if, long ago, the butcher had become something more? Something necessary, and something cursed. That night, the dreams came harder. The clearing again, this time filled with others. Dozens, all standing in a circle, hooded, silent. In the center was the stone, and on it the toy knife. Except now it was made of bone, and it was pointing at him. He woke with sweat soaking his sheets, and the first bird crying in the trees outside. The day had come, and so had the third mark, drawn in ash on his front door. 3 circles, perfectly shaped, waiting. Elric stood at the door, staring at the mark. The 3 circles were dark against the wooden grain, drawn in something finer than charcoal, yet darker than ash. They hadn't been there last night. He was certain. He'd checked the door before locking up, even ran his hand along the wood. But now, the mark stood like a seal, like someone, or something, had stamped its presence into his home. He didn't open the door right away. He just stood there, breathing slow, hand by his sides. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. Once, twice, then nothing. Not even birdsong followed. The town felt hushed, as if holding its breath. That morning, no customers came. No knocks on the door. No deliveries. Nothing but the faint scrape of wine down the alleys and the rustle of paper in his shop as he shuffled through his notes. He went to the back, unwrapped the old butcher's ledger, and flipped to the last few pages. Each line listed orders, names, cuts, weights, deliveries. But then a note he hadn't noticed before. Beneath the final entry written by his father was a single word, return. He stared at it for a long time. It didn't say what was being returned, or to who, just that it was going back. And the ink looked fresh, too fresh, like someone had added it after the journal had been closed. He stepped out of the back room and moved toward the window. From his corner of the town, he could see the main square. That's when he noticed it. All the candles in the windows, burning, flickering. 3 in each house. No one walked the streets, no carts rolled by. Doors were closed, shutters drawn. It felt like everyone knew something he didn't, or worse, remembered something he was only just beginning to understand. By mid-afternoon, a low hum began to build in the air. Not loud, not sharp, just constant, like the town itself was vibrating beneath the surface. He pressed his palm to the counter and felt the faintest tremor, like a heartbeat in the earth. He knew he couldn't wait anymore. With the girl's map in hand and the journal tucked beneath his coat, he stepped out into the street. The door clicked behind him, and he didn't lock it. He had a strange feeling he might not return. He walked to the second mark on the map, the mill. Once the heart of the town's trade, the old grain mill had long since been abandoned. The newer one downriver had taken over, and this one stood forgotten, its wheel rotted, its stones covered in moss and vines. Yet as Elric neared, he saw something new. The door was open, slightly, like someone had gone in and didn't care to close it behind them. He stepped inside. Dust floated through the sunlight, pouring in from cracks in the walls. The place smelled of damp wood and forgotten time. But as he stepped closer to the center, he noticed something carved into the floorboards. Another symbol. Not paint this time. This was scorched into the planks. Circles, of course. And inside them, numbers, 3 of them. He bent down and traced the numbers with his finger. 17, 9, 3. They meant nothing to him. Not at first. But then, he remembered the bells. 17 rings for fire. 9 for warning. 3 for death. A code the town used when words weren't enough. He stood up quickly, the air suddenly feeling colder. The wind outside picked up, rattling the boards and creaking the frame of the building. He felt eyes on him, but when he turned, nothing was there. Just empty space and the slow turn of dust in the light. He left the mill and turned down the alley leading toward the 3rd mark, the one nearest his shop. As he walked, he saw shadows moving in the windows. Not people, not shapes, just flickers like smoke trapped behind glass. He quickened his pace, following the path exactly as the girl had marked. It led him to a narrow gap between 2 brick buildings, a place he rarely noticed, a space barely wide enough to walk through. At the end, a wooden door sat half-covered in ivy. The handle was cold, but the door opened easily. He stepped inside and immediately knew this was older than anything else in town. The walls were stone, not brick. The ceiling arched high above. Candles lined the walls in iron sconces. And along the far side, 3 wooden chairs faced a large table. On the table lay a cloth. Beneath it, shapes. He walked forward and pulled the cloth back slowly. 3 knives, all identical, all marked with a symbol on the handle. And in the center of the table, a parchment. This time, the writing wasn't old or faded. It was clear, crisp. Choose. He stepped back, heart racing. Was this what his father meant? What his grandfather feared? Was this what the girl was trying to lead him toward? The candles flickered once, then again, and the shadows shifted in the corners of the room. He turned sharply, but again, nothing. Still, the tension built. He didn't understand the choice. Was he supposed to take a knife? Refuse them? Offer something? A name? A life? A memory stirred in his mind. His father sharpening blades before dawn. His voice low. We don't just feed them. We remind them. Remind who? He picked up the journal again, flipping to the last few entries. One note, barely readable, almost smudged away. We are the bridge. Then the pages started turning on their own as a gust of wind blew through the room, though no door had opened. The flame on one of the candles stretched sideways, nearly extinguishing, but held. He turned back to the knives. They gleamed despite the dim light. Waiting. The pressure in his head was growing now, a low hum behind his ears. Not sound, something else. Like thoughts that weren't his own were pushing in. Urging. Whispering. Not with words, but with want. He stepped back, and in the silence, a voice spoke. Not from the room. From inside him. The butcher must choose. He turned, stumbled backward, heart thudding. The voice didn't come again, but the knives remained, and suddenly he realized this had happened before. Each generation, each 3rd return, each time, the butcher had stood here and chosen. That's why the trade mattered. That's why the town protected its silence. He looked up, eyes wide, breath shallow, because now the question wasn't what he had to choose. It was who. The candlelight dimmed slightly, and from outside, the sound of footsteps. Dozens. Soft. Deliberate. Approaching. He turned toward the door as the handle began to twist from the outside. But he was no longer sure whether he wanted it to open or not. The door didn't swing open all at once. It creaked slowly, as if the wind, or something more careful, was nudging it from the other side. Elric didn't move. He couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the stone beneath him, heart hammering so loudly he wondered if the candle flames would flicker in rhythm. A figure stepped in, then another, and then a third, all hooded, all silent. They stood just inside the threshold, the candlelight stretching their shadows long across the chamber floor. None of them spoke, but Elric felt the weight of their presence deep in his chest, as if a hand pressed just behind his ribs. He didn't recognize them, not by face but something about the way they held themselves, the way they seemed to fit in this forgotten space, told him they had been here before. Maybe not in this life. Maybe not with him. But in this ritual, in this choice. One of them, taller, broader, stepped forward and touched the table lightly. He didn't look at Elric, just placed a small, flat object beside the knives, then stepped back again into formation. It was a coin, old, worn smooth on one side, but the other still carried a faint image, 3 circles interlocking. Elric stared at it, confused. Then the taller figure finally spoke, voice dry as parchment. "This belongs to you." Elric looked up, but the hood covered the man's face too well. Still, something in his voice sparked a memory, sharp and unsettling. A story his grandfather once told, during one of those drowsy winter evenings by the fire. "You'll know them by the coin," he had said. "When you see it, you'll understand. They come not as friends, not as enemies, just as reminders." And now here it was, a reminder. The figures didn't move again. They simply waited, like sentinels from another time. Elric reached toward the coin, but hesitated, hand hovering above it. It pulsed gently, not physically, but with meaning, as if the moment he touched it, a door would open that could never be shut again. He picked it up. The chamber responded. The candle flames rose higher, crackling. The carved symbol on the floor glowed faintly, and the silence grew so dense it felt alive, like the walls were listening. He turned the coin over in his fingers once, then again, then looked at the knives. 3 of them. No labels, no instructions, just the same question echoing in his skull. Choose. But before he could act, the taller figure stepped forward again, pulling something from beneath his cloak. A book. No, not a book, a ledger. Old, bound in black leather. He placed it gently next to the knives and stepped back. Elric looked down. His breath caught. It was the butcher's book. Not the one in his shop, the older one. The original. The kind his grandfather might have written in. The leather was cracked, the pages yellowed. He flipped it open slowly. Inside were names. So many names, each one followed by a mark. Some had a circle, some had an X, and a few had both. Elric flipped further, then paused as he saw the most recent entries. His father's name, then his mother's, then his. No mark beside his yet, just space. Waiting, he kept turning pages, and saw more names, people still in town, people he served every week, people he waved to in the square. But some were crossed out. Those were the ones who'd vanished, he realized. Disappeared without explanation over the years. The ledger was a record, not just of work, but of something deeper, some kind of agreement. He looked up at the 3 hooded figures, feeling suddenly cold. "What is this?" he asked, voice low, cracking. "You already know," one of them said softly. "The town survives because it is fed," said another. "And you, butcher, decide what it eats," said the third. Elric's hand trembled slightly. "This is a curse," he said, trying to push the book away. "A trap." "No," said the taller one. "It's a tradition." The other 2 nodded, stepping forward now to stand at either side of the table. Every third returned. "The town must be reminded," the tall figure said, "of who it is, of what was built upon. And if I refuse?" Elric asked. Silence. Then one of them said, "Then the town forgets and becomes what it was meant to be." Elric didn't understand. Not fully, but part of him didn't want to. He looked back at the ledger, at the knives, at the flickering candlelight around them all. He understood the stakes, even if the details were blurry. This wasn't about one man's life. It was about the town's shape, its rhythm. He was standing at the hinge between memory and forgetting, between survival and surrender. His hands hovered over the knives. He didn't want this, but he knew now why the butchers never left, why their names were recorded in old church walls, why the girl had said, "The butcher feeds the town, and the town feeds them." This was the moment everything turned. And still, no answers came. Just the weight of the room pressing against him, and the quiet pull of the knife handles beneath his palms. Then he heard it. Footsteps above. Not outside. Inside. In his shop. Moving slowly. Cautiously. Someone had entered. The figures in the room didn't react. Elric turned toward the sound, heart in his throat. Whoever was up there didn't knock, didn't call out. just moved with quiet purpose. He looked back at the ledger and finally understood. It wasn't just a record. It was a map of debts. And now, when it come due, the handle of the center knife felt warm beneath his hand, almost alive. He didn't pull it free. Not yet. But he gripped it and waited as the footsteps came closer, as the door above creaked open, as the town held its breath once more, waiting for the butcher to decide. The knife's handle felt heavier now, as if it had absorbed all the silence pressing into the room. Elric's hand trembled slightly, the weight of choice not just symbolic anymore, but something tangible, almost pulsing. The footsteps above grew slower, deliberate, hesitant. Whoever was there had stopped just above the cellar. A soft creak of the old wood followed, as if a toe had pressed gently into a warped board. Then stillness. The three hooded figures didn't move. They didn't speak. They didn't even seem to breathe. Elric felt stuck between two unknowns. Whatever waited above, and whatever truth lay curled around these knives, this ledger, and these traditions he hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. And then, like a pin dropping in a silent cathedral, the sound came, a voice. Elric, a woman's voice. Soft, sure, and familiar. His breath caught. He let go of the knife. He knew that voice, but it couldn't be. He hadn't heard it in years. Elric, the voice said again. Are you down there? He stepped back, looking toward the stairwell that led up to the shop. No shadow yet, but the voice had sounded so close. Almost behind him. It was his mother's voice. He shook his head. That wasn't possible. She'd passed away when he was 16. They buried her beneath the willow behind the old church. He remembered the funeral, the way the town had stayed silent, the way no one looked him in the eye. He looked to the three figures for an explanation, but they offered none. Still, something in their stance had shifted. Not fear, but expectation. Like the moment they'd been waiting for had finally arrived. Elric, I'm cold, the voice said again. He took a step forward and almost called out, but stopped himself. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. The air had changed again. That humming, the one that had started in the shop earlier, was back. Only now it came with a vibration, like the walls themselves were humming in response. Elric, it's time to come home, the voice said again, and this time, it sounded closer. Too close. He turned sharply, and the chamber was still empty. Just him, the candles, the ledger, the knives, and the figures. Then he saw it. On the far wall, behind the table, a dark slit forming in the stone. It hadn't been there before. It looked like a crack, but it was moving, growing wider, slowly peeling open like an old wound. And from within it, something cold and damp crept out, like fog that didn't belong to air, like breath that never came from lungs. The taller figure stepped forward for the first time on his own. You are the last butcher, he said, but not the only one. Elric frowned. What do you mean? The man raised one hand, pointing toward the crack in the wall. This has happened before, but each time, one of us chose wrongly. Elric's pulse quickened. Wrongly? Then this is a test. No, the man said. This is a cycle. Behind them, the stone crack gave way to something glimmering. Light, but dull, like moonlight underwater. Shapes began to form behind it. Shifting, unsteady. People? No, not people exactly. Faces that looked almost human, but stretched, blurred at the edges. Like someone had painted them and then run wet fingers through the ink. Elric, the voice said again, his mother's voice. This time from the crack. He turned to the figure. That's not her. No, the man said. But she knows what you remember. They all do. Elric felt himself sway slightly. This was too much. The knives, the book, the figures, the crack in the wall. It all felt like a story gone sideways. Like a dream pretending to be real. But the cold was very real. So was the sweat on the back of his neck. So was the knife. And the ledger. And the terrible, growing sense that he wasn't just part of a ritual. He was the ritual. The door above creaked louder now. More footsteps. Not one. Not two. But several. Heavy. Boots dragging. Floorboards sighing. Whoever was up there wasn't alone anymore. The taller figure turned to him again. They're coming because the choice hasn't been made. The longer you delay, the more the town begins to slip. Slip into what? Elric asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't answer. Behind him, the crack widened further. The air was dense now, like syrup in his lungs. Shadows began to crawl along the floor from the breach, black, slow tendrils inching forward. He looked at the ledger. At his name, still blank. Then something strange happened. The ink began to write itself. His name, Elric Van, was no longer just sitting at the end of a row. Now it was glowing, and next to it, a mark began to form. But not a circle, not an X. Something new, a spiral. Elric backed away, breath shallow. What does that mean? The three figures looked toward the book. Even they seemed startled. The man's voice was tight. That wasn't supposed to happen. The shadows were almost at his feet now. The voice from the crack called out again, more urgent now, louder. Elric, don't listen to them. They don't know. You have to stop this. But now it was his voice, echoing back at him. His own voice, pleading, calling out from the rift. He spun toward the crack, eyes wide. What is that? The man spoke slower now. The butcher's blood runs backward. Memory folds in. That voice is a version of you, the one that failed. A cold wave of panic crashed through him. Failed? Then this had all happened before. Many times. Elric looked at the spiral mark again and suddenly remembered something. Not fully, not clearly, but like a dream coming into focus. A corridor of stone. A girl's hand in his. A choice unmade. A scream that was cut short. His hands trembled. The knives were no longer just tools. They were keys. The ledger wasn't just a list. It was a warning. The crack in the wall was now a jagged gash, and behind it, the faces multiplied. Not just familiar, but known. Faces from the town. People who had vanished. People who were still alive. It made no sense. And yet, one face stepped forward. It was his father, but younger. Too young. The figure smiled sadly. You brought it here, he said. Elric turned again. The three hooded figures were no longer in the same spot. They were fading. Fading into the walls, into the candlelight. Becoming less solid. Less real. Like they were just echoes. Just rolls. He realized the truth in a flash. They weren't real people. They were previous butchers. What remained of them, anyway? Locked in this eternal decision. Elric stood alone now, in front of the knives, the ledger glowing beside him, and a tear in reality pulsing behind his back, filled with versions of his life that had already gone terribly wrong. And footsteps still moved upstairs. The door handle turned again. This time it opened, but Elric didn't look up. His eyes stayed on the blade, and the spiral, because somewhere deep in his bones he now knew the final choice hadn't been made yet, but it was closer than ever, and not everyone would survive it. He didn't flinch when the shop door creaked open above. He didn't run, didn't shout. Elric just stood there, frozen, yet somehow more awake than he'd ever felt. Every flicker of the candles lit the walls like lightning. Every beat of his heart echoed down his arms and into his fingertips as they hovered again above the knife handles. The spiral mark on the ledger pulsed once more, faintly glowing as if it were alive. Whispering, calling. Behind him, the crack had stopped widening. The voices beyond it had quieted, no longer pleading or tempting, just waiting, like something on the other side had grown still because it knew a decision was finally close. Bootsteps touched the top of the stairs. Slow, careful, heavy. Elric didn't turn. He kept his eyes fixed on the ledger and the knives, his breath shallow. Whoever, or whatever, was coming didn't rush. They wanted him to know they were there, and not just as an intruder, but as a participant. A quiet voice floated down. Elric, he blinked. That one was real. It was Morel, the apothecary's daughter. She'd grown up just down the lane. They'd traded soup bones and healing herbs more times than he could count. She had always been kind, quiet, observant. She didn't talk much, but when she did, she said things people remembered. Elric opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. A sudden weight pressed against his throat, choking off the air. Fear, yes, but more than that. Dread, because Morel had no reason to be here. No reason to be in his shop at this hour, unless she was part of it. Or worse, unless she'd become part of it. He finally found the strength to call out, his voice low. Don't come down. A pause. Then I saw the light. Her voice was closer. She was at the top step. Elric stepped forward quickly, between the table and the stairwell. "Morel, please. Just go home." But her foot touched the first step, then the second. "I heard something strange tonight," she said. "A sound, like humming, like something in the air." Another step, and "I saw your shop door was open." He gritted his teeth. "You don't understand. This isn't just some late work." Another step. "I read your grandfather's old letters," she said suddenly. "The ones your mother kept in the chest under the window." Elric stopped. "What?" Morel stepped into view. Her face was pale, not from fear, but from knowing too much. "I think I know what this place is," she said. "What the butchers really did." Elric's pulse kicked like a wild animal. "No," he said. "You think you know, but you don't. I didn't. Not until tonight." She glanced at the table, at the ledger. Her eyes found the spiral mark glowing beside his name. "Then it's true," she whispered. She walked slowly to the table and reached out, not to the knives, but to the book. Her fingers hovered just above the pages. "My mother had a mark next to her name," she said quietly. "A circle." Elric's eyes widened. She was part of this. She was this, Morel said, the last butcher's assistant, until she ran. "But you don't run from this, do you?" He shook his head. "No, it follows." Morel finally looked him in the eyes. "Then maybe it's time to stop running." The crack behind them stirred again. Not louder, but deeper, like it had noticed her now, like it understood there was more at stake. "You said the butcher chooses," Morel said. "But maybe the butcher doesn't have to do it alone." Elric frowned. "That's not how it works." "Says who?" she asked. He hesitated, because the truth was he didn't know. Everything had been passed through fear and silence. No one had ever explained the rules. Maybe there were none. Just patterns, and people who assumed those patterns were law. Together, they looked down at the knives. 3, identical, but maybe not anymore. One of them had started to turn slightly on its own, just a fraction of an inch, barely noticeable. Elric stepped forward. Morel did too. Together, they reached out, but not for the same knife. She took the one on the left. He took the center. They both paused. The candles flared. The ledger's spiral began spinning, not in the book, but above it, like smoke twisting through the air. It hovered between them, rising higher until it disappeared into the dark of the ceiling. And then everything went silent, completely. Even the crack behind them was still. Elric looked to Morel, who gripped the knife but didn't raise it. Then they both turned to the stairwell. Another sound now. Soft, wet, dripping. A shadow moved at the top again, but it wasn't human. Not quite. Too tall, too thin, its legs bent the wrong way, its face obscured by something hanging from its shoulders. Fabric, or hair, or something else entirely. Morel gasped. Elric stood frozen. Then the thing spoke, not with words, but with a feeling, a presence that pressed into their skulls and whispered without breath. "Feed us, or become us." It stepped down, slowly, impossibly light. The stairs didn't creak. It didn't blink. "This is the price." Morel raised her knife. Elric did too, but neither moved forward, because for the first time, they weren't thinking of themselves. They were thinking of the town, of the children at the well, of the men in the forge, of the woman who sold bread every morning at the corner. The spiral had changed something. It wasn't just a mark. It was a message. Elric looked at Morel. "If we cut the wrong thing," he whispered, "we just continue the cycle. But if we cut the right one, we end it." The creature reached the bottom stair and paused, waiting. It wanted to know, would they feed it, or would they fight? Together, they turned, not toward it, but toward the crack in the wall. Because they understood now. This wasn't about feeding. It was about binding. The ledger was never a record of meat. It was a prison, one soul at a time. Elric looked back at the table, at the book, and with one movement, he plunged the knife not into the wall, or the creature, or the floor, but into the ledger, straight through the spiral. The blade pierced the book. The room screamed, not with sound, but with pressure. The walls shook. The candles exploded. The creature at the stair hissed, its form flickering like fire and wind. And the crack behind them, it began to close. Morel screamed something, but he couldn't hear it. He grabbed her hand, pulled her close, and as the spiral consumed itself, folding inward, the figures returned. But this time, they weren't cloaked. They were clear. Men, women, butchers, from every era, watching, nodding, not in approval, but in understanding. They had failed, but Elric had not. As the room shattered into light, into dust, into darkness, Elric held Morel's hand tighter, not knowing what came next, but knowing for once, he hadn't fed the town. He had freed it. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the empty, echoing kind that made you wonder if the world had blinked and forgotten you. Elric's knees hit the cold stone floor, Morel still clutching his hand as the last flicker of the spiral's light disappeared into the ledger's pierced heart. Around them, the candle flames had vanished. Only smoke rose now, thin and curling, drifting up into the ceiling's black void. And the creature was gone. Not just vanished, but undone, as if it had never truly belonged to this world. Not a scream, not a shadow, just a whisper of something old retreating back into the deep where it had first crawled from. The stairs above creaked again, but this time no one stood there. No footsteps, no weight, just an emptiness that felt right. Morel let out a shaky breath. Is it over? Elric looked at the ledger. The knife still stood buried in the pages, the spiral mark now dark and scorched beneath it. He nodded slowly, but didn't speak. He didn't trust his voice. His throat felt raw, like something had passed through him that didn't belong. The three butcher spirits that had once stood beside the table were nowhere to be seen. Their presence had left behind a faint outline on the stone, but even that was fading now. The room was becoming what it used to be, a cellar. Just stone, dust, and a table that bore the memory of something much older than flesh. Morel stood first. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she forced herself upright. She walked to the ledger and gently touched the cover. The heat had faded. It was just paper again. Paper and blood. She looked down and whispered, "What happens now?" Elric stood too. Slower. Everything in his body ached. He looked toward the closed crack in the wall, then back to her. "I don't know. But whatever that thing was, whatever cycle the butchers were stuck in, we broke it." They climbed the steps together. The shop above was dark, but intact. Outside, the fog that had once curled thick around the streets had thinned to a pale mist. The lantern across the lane flickered, as if relieved. A few birds had begun to chirp. Dawn was coming, and with it, the life of the town would return. But as Elric reached to close the cellar door behind them, he noticed something strange. There was a new mark on the underside of the door. Carved, shallow and crude. Not a spiral. A fork. Two branching lines. He stared at it for a long moment, and something inside his chest twisted that hadn't been there before. He didn't tell Morel. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some things didn't need to be said. Some warnings were better left unspoken. They walked into the street, side by side, just as the sun began to break over the rooftops. The town looked the same, but Elric knew it wasn't. Something had shifted. Freed, maybe, or just loosened. Later that morning, he returned to the shop alone. Morel had gone to check on her father. He didn't ask her to stay. He needed a moment. Maybe many. The cellar looked different now. Not darker, just emptier. The knife was still buried in the ledger, but the table had cracked straight down the middle, clean and silent, like it had decided to rest. Elric didn't try to pull the blade out. He lit a single candle, placed it on the table, and turned to leave. But just as he reached the stairs, he heard a page turn. Slow, deliberate. He turned. No one was there. The ledger remained closed. But he walked back slowly, heart pounding, and leaned over it. The knife had not moved, but a new name had appeared beneath his. Maris Van. He froze. That wasn't Morel. That was his daughter's name. But she'd only just turned 2. Elric's breath left him in a cold rush. He staggered backward, knocking over the candle, its flames sputtering out on the stone. He grabbed the ledger, yanked it open, and flipped through the pages, his fingers trembling. Names he didn't recognize filled the old parchment. But near the back, new entries. Elric Van. Maris Van. No spiral beside hers. Not yet, but space for one. He backed away slowly, shut the book, stepped into the shadows, and closed the door behind him. He didn't speak a word of it when Morel returned. He didn't mention it to the town, which woke up that morning as if nothing had happened. The well water tasted fresher. The skies stayed clearer. People smiled more, though they didn't know why. But Elric knew. He had ended something and begun something else. The spiral hadn't been a symbol of death. It had been a gate. And sometimes, when he looked into his daughter's eyes, he saw the faintest shimmer of light behind them. A flicker, like candlelight twisting, waiting, watching, and he wondered, had he freed them, or had he invited something else in? Because some stories don't end with the hero winning. Some end with the door closed, but not locked. And Elric was starting to wonder if, deep beneath the town, something was still listening, still waiting for the butcher's blood. The days that followed were quiet. Elric returned to the shop each morning like nothing had changed, but inside, everything had. The meats still hung, the hooks still swayed gently with each breeze, and the smell of smoke and salt still clung to the beams. But the cellar beneath his feet no longer felt like part of the shop. It felt like something else now, something buried and sealed, but not forgotten. Morel didn't bring it up again. Neither did Elric. They simply existed in the space between what had happened and what might come. Sometimes she would bring him herbs or pass by the door and linger a little longer than necessary, as if listening for something. Elric noticed, but he didn't stop her. He found comfort in knowing someone else remembered too. At night, when the streets emptied and the final candles and windows flickered out, Elric would sit in the dark with Maris cradled in his arms. She didn't cry much, not like other children. Her eyes were large, watchful, always tracking shadows that no one else noticed. When she smiled, it came slow and thoughtful, like she was choosing to share something just for him. He didn't tell anyone about the name in the ledger. Not yet. He hoped it had been a mistake. A leftover mark from the chaos. Something miswritten, but in his gut he knew better. Still, nothing strange happened. Days passed, then weeks. The strange fog didn't return. No new voices. No marks. The cellar stayed locked. The key sat untouched on a nail behind the counter. But one evening, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the air turned to ash-colored dusk, Elric stood outside and heard something faint in the wind. A whisper, not a word, just a pressure, like the world was breathing in. He turned to the door. Inside, Maris sat in the back corner of the shop, stacking wooden blocks. Her tiny hands were precise, careful, too careful. He watched her for a long time, then turned and walked slowly down the street to Morel's house. She opened the door before he even knocked. "I felt it too," she said quietly. He stepped inside, and the silence closed behind him like a curtain. The apothecary shop was lit by soft lanterns, their glow painting long golden shadows along the shelves of dried roots and bottled tinctures. Morel poured them each a cup of tea, something warm with chamomile and crushed fennel, and sat across from him at the old work table. "I think," Elric said softly, "it's not over." She nodded. "It never really is." They sipped in silence for a while. Finally, Morel leaned forward. "Tell me." He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, her name's in the ledger. Morel blinked, slowly. She didn't seem surprised. "Maris." He nodded. "No mark yet, but it's there." Morel let out a long breath. Then maybe this was never about just ending something. Maybe it was about passing something. "That's what I'm afraid of," Elric whispered. They sat quietly again, the weight of their choices pressing between them. Then Morel said, "My mother never said much about her time in the butcher's circle. But once, when I was small, I remember asking her why she never cut meat anymore. She just looked at me and said, because it's not the cutting that's dangerous. It's the knowing." Elric frowned. "The knowing." She nodded. "Once you've seen what lies behind the veil, what the knives really reach, your hands are never quite clean again." Outside, a cart rolled past. A dog barked in the distance. Life went on, but in that little apothecary shop, time hung still. Finally, Elric stood. "I want to believe she's safe," he said. "That what I did was enough." Morel stood too. "Then let's make sure it is." He looked at her. "You'd help." She met his eyes. "You helped me. You didn't have to." They left together, walking side by side under the moonlight. Back in the butcher's shop, Maris had fallen asleep on the floor beside her wooden blocks. Elric carried her gently upstairs and tucked her into her small bed. He sat beside her for a long time, listening to the even rhythm of her breathing. Morel waited downstairs, her hands resting on the locked cellar door. He joined her when the child was fast asleep. "She doesn't belong to it," Elric said firmly. "Not if I can help it." Morel nodded. "Then we need to find out why the book chose her." They opened the cellar together. For the first time in weeks, Elric descended the steps without dread. The air was still cold, but not biting. The shadows still clung to the corners, but they didn't move. The cracked table was exactly as they had left it. The knife still buried in the ledger. But something about the space felt calmer, as if the storm had passed, but left a warning behind. They approached the table together. Elric reached for the ledger, but before he could touch it, the pages turned. Not by wind, by will. They stopped on a new page, one neither of them had seen. No names, just a symbol, a forked path, drawn in ink so deep it almost shimmered. And beneath it, words written in the old butcher's hand. Blood opens the door. Memory closes it. Morel touched the page gently. What does it mean? Elric stared at the page. Maybe the ledger isn't just for recording souls. Maybe it's a guide, Morel whispered. A way to change the pattern. He reached forward and turned the page. This time, there was no resistance. And on the next leaf, a diagram. Simple but haunting. A child's hand. A circle around it, and 3 marks drawn beside it. One straight, one curved, one broken. Morel whispered, "Choices." The candle flickered beside them, and Elric said, quietly, "Then maybe she doesn't have to become anything. Maybe we teach her to choose." For the first time in what felt like ages, he smiled. Because sometimes when the darkness passes, it doesn't disappear, it just steps back and lets the light show what it had been hiding. And now, at last, Elric understood. He was never meant to be just a butcher. He was meant to be a guardian, a keeper of the knowledge. And now, that knowledge was his to protect. Not with fear, but with love, with choice, with memory, and with the quiet promise that whatever came next, his daughter would never face it alone. The next morning came quietly, with soft golden sunlight creeping over the rooftops and slipping through the butcher shop windows. Elric stood behind the counter as he always did, wiping down the wooden surface with practiced, rhythmic strokes. But there was a difference in the air. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt lighter, like a weight had been set down, gently, finally. The cellar door remained locked, but he no longer felt haunted by it. Instead, it had become a part of the shop's history, like the worn floorboards, the burnished cleaver handle, or the faded hook where his father once hung his apron. It would always be there, but it no longer ruled over him. He'd made peace with it, not by forgetting, but by understanding it didn't have to control what came next. Morel stopped by just before noon, carrying a bundle of dried herbs and a wrapped loaf of bread. She smiled as she stepped inside, the way someone does when they've seen the worst and chosen to move forward anyway. Elric took the parcel, nodding his thanks, and poured them each a cup of tea. "She sleep well?" Morel asked, settling into the stool near the window. Like nothing ever happened, Elric replied, his gaze drifting toward the stairs that led up to Maris's room. "Dreamless, I think. Peaceful." Morel sipped her tea, watching him carefully. "And the book?" He shook his head. "No new pages. No new names. Just quiet." "That's good," she said. "Maybe it's over. Maybe." But he didn't sound entirely sure. Not in a fearful way. More like someone who knew that some stories didn't end, they just changed shape. He'd come to accept that. The spiral wasn't about horror or power. It was about memory, legacy, choice. He had a choice now. A few villagers passed by the window, offering brief waves or a tip of the hat. Life in the town had returned to its usual rhythm. The fog never came back. The streets were busier. Even the market had a livelier tone. It was as if something under the surface had eased, like the village could breathe again. Elric hadn't told anyone about the ledger, or the shadow, or the centuries-old curse. He didn't need to. The people didn't ask, and the town didn't seem to remember. But that was okay. Sometimes, stories lived best in silence, passed down through instincts and quiet choices. Later that evening, as the sun slipped low and painted everything in shades of amber, Elric took Maris for a walk along the edge of the village. Her tiny hand held tightly in his. She looked up at the sky with wide, curious eyes. Every bird call made her giggle. Every leaf on the wind made her reach. He watched her with a mixture of awe and worry, but mostly love. She was growing quickly, and something about her eyes always felt older than her years. But that didn't scare him anymore. It just made him more determined to guide her well. As they walked, she suddenly stopped near the old stone well in the square. She stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at her father. "Is it sleeping?" she asked. Elric's heart paused. "What, sweetheart?" She pointed to the well. "The thing down there. It's sleeping now, right?" He knelt slowly. "Why do you say that?" She shrugged. "I hear it sometimes. But not bad. Just tired." Elric didn't panic. He didn't grab her or run. He looked into her eyes and saw no fear. Only curiosity. He nodded gently. "Yes, I think it's sleeping, and I think it wants to rest for a long time." She smiled and skipped ahead. That night, after Maris was tucked into bed, Elric sat at the old counter with a ledger resting in front of him. He didn't open it. He just sat with it, watching the candlelight flicker across the cover. Morel had once told him that memory was more powerful than magic, that what we choose to remember and how we pass it on is what keeps the world balanced. So he made a decision. He didn't burn the ledger. He didn't bury it. Instead, he wrapped it carefully in cloth, sealed it in an old iron box, and hid it deep beneath the floorboards of the cellar. Not to forget it, but to preserve it, in case it was ever needed again, but with the hope that it wouldn't be. Then he closed the cellar door one final time. The next morning, the butcher shop smelled like rosemary and salt. The light felt warmer. The cleavers hung silently, and the scales tipped perfectly even. Elric whistled a quiet tune as he opened the shutters and greeted the first customer of the day. Life moved on. Morel eventually reopened her apothecary full-time. She and Elric stayed close, their bond shaped not by romance, but by shared experience. They spoke often and sometimes sat in silence by the fire, knowing the world had layers most would never understand. And Maris grew. She laughed easily, learned quickly, and asked questions that made even the oldest villagers pause. But she never spoke of the spiral again. She slept through the nights, dreamed of clouds and stars, and ran through the streets like any other child. Sometimes, when Elric watched her play, he would see her pause and look at the horizon with a far-off expression. But then she'd blink and run off again, laughter trailing behind her like sunlight. Years passed, and eventually, Elric grew old. The butcher's shop passed to another family. The cellar was never opened again, though its key remained on the same nail. Maris became a healer, like Morel. She said she preferred helping people before they broke, rather than after. She never asked about the ledger. But one night, as Elric sat quietly by the fire, she brought him a cup of tea and said softly, "I know you protected me. Whatever it was, you kept it from reaching me." Elric smiled. "I tried." She sat beside him. "You succeeded." He believed her. And in that final stretch of life, he found peace. Not because everything had been solved, but because he had chosen to do the right thing, even when it was terrifying. That, he learned, was the real legacy. Not knives, not ledgers, not spirals, but choice, and love, and memory. Because in the end, that's what made the butcher's life matter. Not the blood, but the decision not to pass it on. And somewhere, in the quiet dark of a forgotten cellar, the ledger waited. Silent, at peace, but listening, just in case. And the village slept soundly. For now.